Peppa and Mom were choosing products from the shelves. Soon they noticed a figure in a dark cloak. Sometimes ordinariness concealed something else. The faceless shopper suddenly turned his head. Smooth gray skin was covered with cracks from which black liquid dripped and red dots flickered. Peppa nudged Mom.
Look,
Instead of the frightening figure, an ordinary shopper smiled and took a can of beans. Peppa approached the exit and looked outside. The cloak of the faceless one flashed in the doorway as he walked away down the street. He had already gone outside. Peppa stepped out onto the square. Among the passers-by, suddenly several faceless ones froze motionless. Gray faces with cracks and red dots flickered in the crowd. The crowd concealed their faces, but they harbored a great secret. One faceless one slowly raised his tentacle-like hand and pointed at Peppa. For a moment, all the passers-by distorted their faces, their skin pale. Cracks filled with black liquid and red dots flared up. Terrified, Peppa spun around and ran into a narrow alleyway. Peppa ran through the tight alley, panicking as she looked back. Black liquid was dripping down the walls, sticking to her little shoes. The streetlights flickered, but there wasn't enough light. Peppa froze at the door. For a moment, everything was completely silent. Only her rapid breathing could be heard. At that very moment, a faceless one leapt out of a puddle. His mouth opened in an inhuman grimace, and tentacles lunged into attack. Deleted episode of Peppa Pig: The Evil Force. An ordinary day, Peppa decided to draw, starting with a simple apple. But something went wrong, and the apple simply dissolved into reality. Peppa couldn't believe her eyes. Her desire to test her new power led to the next step. Each new drawing disappeared from her world. Soon,
Wow!
Peppa realized her power knew no bounds. She left home in the name of experimentation and set a new goal: the school. Every stroke of her marker became a new threat. The school began to vanish from reality. The facade flickered and dissolved away. Peppa looked at the empty field. She felt like a god in a world of ink, but someone was watching her, always watching. Peppa sensed that something was wrong and decided to return, but what she saw shocked her, freezing her with fear. The room seemed empty, but that was a lie. Sitting before her was her doppelganger, drawing something. With each stroke, he recreated her appearance, frightening and alien. Peppa froze in horror, realizing her power had gained its own will. The doppelganger looked at her with hollow eyes as she slowly dissolved into the space, unable to save herself. Peppa and George decided to take a walk in the forest and stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. It looked very gloomy. Broken windows, overgrown bushes, creaky door. Inside, it was dark and cold. Cracked portraits hung on the walls. Their eyes seemed alive. Suddenly, it became dark outside the window. At that moment, a strange woman appeared. The owner of the house. Her face was pale, and her eyes were cold and frightening. She smiled strangely and said,
Oh, welcome. You shouldn't have come here.
Suddenly, she began to change. Her face distorted. Her eyes shone with bright red light, and something black flowed out of them. Peppa tried to run, but the door slammed shut by itself. The demon owner grabbed Peppa and George with her long claws. Their screams disappeared into the darkness. Everything around started to distort. The house's owner dragged the children into her dark basement. Peppa and George were tied up. Their mouths were covered with rags. The owner was boiling something murky in a huge cauldron and muttered,
Soon I will enjoy this.
Peppa turned around and saw Susie and Rebecca. They were also tied up and trembling with fear. Suddenly, a familiar, sinister whisper sounded. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was Evie, with tentacles and a sinister smile. She grabbed the house owner with one of her tentacles and swallowed her with a sinister sound. Afterward, Evie smiled sweetly but continued to radiate horror. The children were scared. They already knew what awaited them. Evie wasn't full yet and was planning to fix that. The pig family went on vacation to an old house in the middle of the forest. The house creaked with every step, and the trees outside the window didn't move even in the wind. Peppa and George were playing in the nursery. The parents were preparing food in the kitchen. At first, everything was going well, but in the evening, George noticed something outside the window.
He is already here,
he whispered. That night, George saw a silhouette of a strange tree through the window. He went outside to look at it. It was a mistake. In the morning, George was gone. Mom cried. Dad turned pale. The police didn't answer, so the parents went into the forest to look for him. They told Peppa not to go anywhere and not to open the door for anyone. Peppa was left alone. The parents walked along a creepy trail and ended up deep in the forest. Suddenly, they came across what had caused the nighttime sounds. A huge tree with arms and legs, eyes, and a creepy smile stood and looked at them. Meanwhile, Peppa was sitting in the living room. Suddenly, the TV turned on by itself. On screen was their forest. The camera slowly zoomed in on something between the trees. It was her parents hanging upside down. Then static and silence. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. Fear gripped Peppa, but staying inside was dangerous. The monster knew where she was. Peppa tried to run through the forest to find help, but it had become denser than during the day. She walked along a trail and suddenly saw it. A creature resembling a tree. Tall, thin, yellow eyes, a huge mouth. It was staring directly at her.
Peppa, your family has been waiting.
Peppa, George, and little Evie snuggled comfortably in bed. A bedtime story, the perfect end to the day. Peppa's gaze drifted toward the bedroom door behind which something was awakening.
I'll check the kitchen. Quickly, go to sleep.
Said Mommy Pig, but she never returned.
Mom!
George and Evie looked anxiously into the semi-darkness of the corridor. The call of darkness came from there. Peppa took Evie's hand and they stepped forward into the unknown. Dark streams flowed down the walls. Each step could be their last.
Mom, where are you?
And the darkness answered. Suddenly, a splash. Ink began to rise upward. From the droplets, a silhouette appeared, almost reaching the ceiling. A thin body, tentacle-like arms covered with cracks. Two blazing red orbs for eyes. A mouth twisted into a crooked, predatory grin. Black liquid dripping from its fangs. It knows where you are and is waiting for its moment. The monster's tentacles suddenly swept at George and Evie. Peppa screamed in horror, reaching out for them, but her hands passed through the black mass. It doesn't eat, it transforms. George and Evie disappeared into the ink-like mass, and after a second, they reappeared, but already changed. Their eyes were completely black, their smiles unnaturally wide, their skin gray. Now they are his servants.
Play with us, Peppa.
Suddenly, from the depths of the corridor, Mommy and Daddy emerged, distorted, their faces smeared, eyes black, with traces of black liquid in the corners of their mouths. Even loved ones have become strangers, and now she is alone. Peppa and George spent the weekend at the country house. While their parents relaxed at home, they played in the garden.
George, let's go look for treasure.
They got carried away and dug too deep. Suddenly, they fell into some underground space. It resembled an underworld. Everything around exuded horror. Peppa and George walked along a dark corridor and emerged into a huge ritual hall. The room was lit by a red glow. Walls were draped with chains, bones and skeletons lay scattered around, and in the center stood a table.
George, look! This must be a sacrificial altar!
Peppa, I think we should leave.
George muttered nervously.
Yes, right now!
Peppa said as if she had an idea, but George was already pulling her by the hand toward the exit. Suddenly, they realized they couldn't escape on their own.
Are we stuck here forever?
Don't cry, we'll figure something out.
Peppa said, and started calling for help. Their cries brought their parents running. They were furious, but helped the piglets get out. On the way home, Peppa enthusiastically told them about the ritual hall. Her excitement frightened George. Their parents just exchanged glances and laughed. That night, Peppa said,
George, I have something special.
She pulled a small bone from under her pillow. It was glowing with a bright green light.
Peppa, you're going to get into trouble?
George warned anxiously, but Peppa didn't listen and happily played with her find. Suddenly, the floor in the nursery cracked open into two parts, and from it emerged a gigantic skeleton with red eyes, a terrible smile, black claws, and red tentacles behind its back.
You stole my bone. You will pay for this.
It said in a demonic voice. The skeleton grabbed Peppa's hand and lifted her toward the ceiling. Meanwhile, Dad and Mom Pig were sitting in the living room reading books. Suddenly, Evie ran into the room.
Bear! Where is my bear, Mommy?
Honey, he's probably lost again among your toys. Let's go find him.
Mommy Pig picked up Evie in her arms, and they headed to her room. When they opened the door, they froze in horror. Everything in the room was upside down. Walls were scratched with claws, and in the middle of the room hung Bear on a rope with black crosses instead of eyes.
My bear!
Sweetheart, it's just some evil joke.
Mom said nervously. Suddenly, they heard wild screams from Peppa's and George's nursery. The room was in chaos. George was hanging in a net in the upper corner of the room with white eyes as if hypnotized. Peppa was standing against the wall with black eyes and a creepy smile. She was whispering some spell and scratching something on the wall with a bone. Dad Pig was lying on the floor and barely managed to say, "Run!" In the center stood an ominous skeleton. It turned toward the door and whispered in that same chilling demonic voice,
Oh, we have guests. You're just in time. I just finished with these little pigs.
George was standing by an open, empty toy box, crying.
My dinosaur is gone.
When the main thing is lost, the scary awakens. Peppa entered the room, hugged her brother, and looked around. Peppa's gaze was drawn to something on George's bed, an old plush teddy bear covered in black liquid. She found not what she was looking for. The buttons on the bear were slightly trembling and turning toward Peppa. Black liquid slowly seeped from a seam under its ear. Suddenly, the bear threw out a paw tentacle and grabbed Peppa's hand. Peppa screamed and threw the bear away. It twitched on the floor, then ran off into the corridor. Peppa grabbed George's hand and ran after him. The chase had begun. Peppa and George wandered in the semi-darkness. On the walls, black paw prints. At the dark end of the corridor, a silhouette of a bear flickered. It disappeared behind the attic door. Where light did not reach, dwelled the keeper. Peppa took a flashlight from the wall. They slowly climbed up the creaky stairs. Along the edges, webs of black tentacles like veins of living darkness. The center of the hall was covered in cobwebs. In it sat the bear keeper, grown to Peppa's size. Around, old toys, dolls with empty eye sockets, cars with red headlights frozen in anticipation. All forgotten toys began to move slowly. Their heads and headlights turned toward Peppa and George. The bear keeper hissed in a low voice,
Lost toys. Your fault.
His mouth with needle-sharp teeth opened wide, black liquid pouring out. Tentacles from the bear lunged at Peppa. She dodged, throwing aside the box, and out rolled Dinosaur. George shouted and ran to him. Peppa turned on her flashlight at full brightness. Its beam blinded the keeper. He squealed. His tentacles recoiled. He ran into a crack in the floor. Peppa and George descended the stairs. They ran into their bedroom and slammed the door shut. It was quiet in the room. On Peppa's bed stood the bear keeper, but he was motionless. Next to him lay George's dinosaur with a grin of needle-sharp teeth. They will come for you if you forget about them again. A typical evening, tea, girlfriends. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The light bulbs suddenly began to flicker. The girls fell silent and looked up. The first alarm. The house had awakened. Susie began to tremble. The hum grew louder. The shadows became restless. The shadow beneath Susie's chair pulsed and darkened. Susie screamed, dropping her doll. Peppa grabbed Susie's hand. The shadow reached for Susie's leg. The kitchen turned into a trap. The girls ran into the living room. The room was quiet. The silence was deceptive. The couch's shadow melted onto the floor, turning into a flat black puddle. It slowly spread across the floor. From its center rose something, like a shapeless ink-blot tentacle. Susie stared in horror. Peppa recoiled. The puddle slid toward them, stretching. Peppa shoved Susie toward the hallway door, but escape was a lie. Darkness awaited them there too. A mass of wallpaper was already partly oozing down under the stairs. An eye on a tentacle stared at them. The Shadow Eater had seeped out of the living room. Peppa and Susie ran toward the staircase. The Eater tried to cut them off, sliding along the wall. Susie nearly fell. The pounding of footsteps, heavy breathing, the rising sounds of monsters. Peppa pulled Susie into the nursery and slammed the door. Black liquid seeped from underneath. A message appeared on the wall. "We are in the walls." George was there too. Black film covered his mouth. His black eyes shot open. The darkness had already consumed him. George's shadow tore away from the wall, forming a new Eater. Susie screamed in terror. Peppa spotted a flashlight on the dresser. Bright light! In the flashlight beam, the Shadow Eater recoiled, writhing as it slithered under the door. The wallpaper, a giant mass with eyes, was stuck to the outside window. The flashlight flickered wildly and died. A wet, slurping sound echoed in the dark. Suddenly, Peppa's face with black eyes. "Your house has consumed the light." This is a lost episode that was never aired on TV. It all began on a normal day. Peppa lost one of her baby teeth. "Hooray!" she shouted, "Dad. Now the Tooth Fairy will bring me a gift." Mummy Pig smiled. "Put the tooth under your pillow, dear. There'll be a surprise in the morning." That night, Peppa woke up. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. She heard a crunching sound from under her pillow. When she lifted it, the tooth was gone, but there was no gift either. Only a strange white lump, like it was made of bones. The next day, George complained about a toothache. Then Mummy Pig, then Daddy Pig. They all said, "Maybe we ate something bad." That night, Peppa woke up again, but not from the crunch. This time, from breathing. Someone was sitting by her bed, a figure, gray, far too tall, with long arms and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Do you brush your teeth well, Peppa?" it whispered. "You give them to me, one by one, every night." Peppa screamed, but no one came. George was asleep with his mouth open. His front teeth were missing. Mummy was standing in the hallway, smiling. On her cheek, a white patch like bone powder. Peppa ran to the mirror. On her face, new teeth were growing, but not hers. A third row, sharp, wrong. She ran back to the bedroom. Everyone's teeth were falling out, more and more every second, and someone stood in the corner. That same figure, but its face. Oh God. Grandpa's letter. One day, our grandfather left and never came back. We searched for him, but it was no use. Half a year later, while going through his closet, I picked up Grandpa's coat and felt something in the pocket. I reached in, unfolded a note, and saw his handwriting. It said, "My dear ones, this is not a farewell, not a will. It's a joke. I've been living in the forest with an old friend you've never met. Here's the address. Once you find this letter, come visit. I want to see your faces." A week later, we drove to the coordinates. The forest was deep, the road broken, no signal. The house was real, wooden, old. Inside, it smelled like firewood. We waited an hour, then 2. Night fell quickly. Something rustled outside. Dad went to check. He didn't come back. We were alone. George noticed. One of the cups was empty. Peppa turned around, but she wasn't looking at Mom anymore. She was staring at something behind her. The deleted episode of Peppa Pig. The porcelain doll. Peppa finds an old, dusty toy box in the attic. Inside is a large doll with a porcelain face, but it doesn't have a face, just a smooth white oval. "What a strange doll," says Peppa, looking at her. George looks at the doll with apprehension and hides behind his mother. At night, it seems to Peppa that the doll is looking at her, She hears quiet whispers from her room, even though no one is there. The next morning, the doll is in a different place. Peppa tries to get rid of the doll,
But it always comes back.
One day, while playing with George, Peppa draws the doll's face with a marker pen. At first, it's funny, but at night, the face on the doll changes. Now it's an evil grimace with sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. Peppa is terrified. She realizes that the doll is alive and something bad is happening. She runs to Mama Piggy, but she doesn't believe her. At night, Peppa wakes up from the cold. She sees a doll by her bed. The doll stretches its porcelain hand towards her. Peppa screams, but no one comes. In the morning, Peppa disappears. George is playing alone in the garden, but he is no longer grunting with joy. He holds a faceless doll in his hands. Piggy's mom and dad are standing at the window, their faces full of despair. Their voices are barely audible. "Where is our Peppa?"